It is said that in the 13th century, Emperor Frederick II conducted a cruel experiment. In order to find out which language humans develop on their own if they are not influenced by their surrounding, are they going to speak Hebrew or are they going to speak Greek, Latin or Arabic? Frederick took away some babies from their mummies and gave them to nurses. And these nurses were not allowed to speak with the infants, they were not allowed to touch the infants, they only were allowed to breastfeed them and sometimes to wash them. Unfortunately, he never found out what the original language is. By the way, of course, today we know there is no original language. If you don't get any language input, you of course won't learn any language. Unfortunately, his experiment went terribly wrong. It is said that all the infants, because they didn't get any love, all the infants died. And even though this legend is today strongly questioned by historians, because they say there's only one report in history about this experiment, and this report comes from a guy called Salim Bene from Parma, and this guy was a political opponent from Frederick II, so maybe he made this story up to make Frederick look quite bad. Nevertheless, today we know touch and petting is extremely important for the upbringing of little children. There are numerous experiments, for example with rats, in which one could show that rats that were licked and groomed more often from their mummies are more resistant in stress situations. But there are also experiments with human children in which, for example, one group of infants received more touch, more petting than another one, and the touch group really seems to develop faster and better. So people react quite sensitive to touch, and as you might see on the studies we will discuss, we sometimes react stronger to touch than we might think. One area in which touch can be a very helpful tool, I mean we just talked about the upbringing of infants, one area is education. Every parent knows that sometimes it can be very hard to make the child do what's good for it. So if, for example, when it's about doing homework or learning for a test at school, sometimes it can be very hard to convince the child, well, this is good for you. And wouldn't it be great to be more effective in such a situation? Well, the study from Leonard, Berkowitz and Schusterman, published in 2014, the title of the study was "The Effect of Friendly Touch on Delay of Gratification in Preschool Children," published in the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology. This study tells us that the use of touch might make you more effective. Because in this study they conducted a classic delay of gratification task. The children were shown a cup under which 5 candies were hidden, and the child was told, all you have to do to get the candies is to wait until I come back, because I will leave the room to do some paperwork, and when I come back you can have all the candies. In one group, the experimenter touched the children softly on their back, just like a parent would do that in order to encourage the child. And it turned out that the children who were touched on their back were indeed more willing to wait for the candies. They waited about 2 minutes and 13 seconds longer. If you are a teacher, you might say, well, that's interesting, but does this also work with a whole class of pupils? Can I use non-verbal feedback like touching, patting, hugging, whatever, in order to improve the students' on-task behavior, in order to make them more attentive? If we take a look at the study by Kastin and Klock, for example, published in 1973, the title of the study was "The Effect of Nonverbal Teacher Approval on Student Attentive Behavior," the answer seems to be yes. Because what they did in this study is to train the teacher of a class with mentally handicapped children, Mentally handicapped means that they had an IQ from about 48 to 73. They trained the teacher to intentionally use more non-verbal feedback, like smiling, patting, touching on the shoulder, hugging, etc. And what's particularly interesting about this study is the study design. So they started with observing the behavior of the class and the teacher when the teacher had not been trained yet. So this was the baseline condition. And during these days, not only the teacher was observed, whether he uses and how much of non-verbal feedback he uses, but also and especially the children were observed how attentive they were they sitting quietly, did they chat with their neighbors, and especially were they working on their assigned tasks. After the observation of the baseline behavior, the teacher had received this training. For some days now it was observed what was the effect of this training. And it turned out that during this phase the children were indeed more attentive. And after some days, more exactly it were 9 days, after 9 days the teacher was told, okay, from now on we want you to behave just like you behaved before the training. So the teacher behaved like he usually did, and it turned out the children were again less attentive. They were chatting more with their neighbors, they were not able to sit quietly, etc. And this lasted for some days. And after these days, again the teacher was told, okay, now remember what we told you, what we trained you, use the non-verbal feedback more often. And when the teacher used more touch, more hugging, more patting, more smiling, again the children behaved more attentive. So this shows for a class setting that the use of touch, of non-verbal feedback can be very effective. But on the other hand, you might say, well, those children were a quite unusual sample. I mean, they had a quite low IQ, they were less intelligent than average children. So would this work with normal school children as well? And therefore the next study is very interesting, because in the study by Weldal and colleagues published in 1986, the title of the study was "A Touch of Reinforcement: The Effects of Contingent Teacher Touch on the Classroom Behavior of Young Children." Because in this study the participants were 115 normal school children. Their age was about 5 to 6 years. And the teachers of these children, all in all it were 4 teachers, received a teacher training in which they learned to give non-verbal feedback more contingent, which means you only give non-verbal feedback like patting on the back when the child really did something good. Only, for example, when he or she solved a really difficult problem. So they were not told to increase the number of non-verbal feedback overall, but they were only told to use it more contingent, more clever, one could say. And again, in this study with the normal school children, it turned out that the intervention seemed to be quite successful. The children who were again observed by raters during the lessons became more attentive. They were more concentrated on the tasks they were told to work on. The studies we discussed so far were all about the effects of touch on little children. So one might wonder, does this work with grown-ups as well? Does it work, for example, with students at a university? Well, take a look at the study by Giger, published in 2004 in the journal Social Psychology of Education, in which 105 students who participated in a statistics course took part in a study without knowing it. Because what the statistics professor did was to go from one student to another while the students were solving statistic problems. And from time to time he said to some students, That's good, well done. And while he said so, he sometimes touched the students on their arms, just for reinforcement, well done. And it turned out that later on, when the professor asked all students, and you probably know the situation from school, he asked, would anyone like to come forward and write the solution on the blackboard? And as you know from school, this is a situation in which quite often nobody is willing to come forward. But it turned out that those students who were touched by the professor were much more willing to participate and were much more willing to show their solution to all other students on the blackboard. So an encouraging touch can also improve participation of students in a course at the university.